Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I am going to teach you the basics of scripting. So there's a couple of things we need to talk about this because Papyrus, which is the language that Fallout 4 uses for its scripting, is a pretty full-featured and deep programming language. But I realized that teaching people to program from scratch is a very tall order, and it could be an entire series in itself. And there's already a lot of resources that cover that out on the internet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and teach scripting and the things that go along with it in as low level a way as I can. But there are some certain terminologies and assumptions I'm going to have to make that you at least made an effort to learn the very basics of programming. So concepts like variables, if statements, functions. I'll go in a little into it, but at some point it just becomes a thing where to give you guys proper training on it, it would just be me reinventing the wheel in a way that's been done a million times. Because once you understand the basics of programming, which you can learn in any language at all, then it's a lot easier to talk about these concepts, and I'll be able to get through things a lot quicker. So this first tutorial is probably going to be pretty long, just because I want to cover some of the things that have to do with the language itself, like some of the particulars that the way Papyrus works and maybe isn't the same in every language, so that those of you who are experienced programmers can pick this up. But I am going to show you guys around a little bit on the creationkit.com site, because there's a lot of information for those of you who are experienced programmers. One of my goals here is to be able to teach people who have very little scripting experience to at least feel comfortable wandering around a script. And for those of you who are experienced programmers, I want to help you guys get past all of the hiccups that it requires, like the weird things about Papyrus, or the concepts that took a while to click for me, so that you guys can get up to speed, so you can use the full power of the knowledge you already have with building stuff for Fallout 4. And a lot of this will apply to Skyrim, and likely to whatever the next game is as well, and probably 76 whenever they open up modding to that. So I'm going to try and cover both sides of this, as the absolute beginner and the experienced pro. So I'm sure for each of you there will be things in this video to love and things to hate, and that will probably be the case for all of my scripting videos. But with scripting, one thing you have to know is that a lot of it has to do with the actual game engine and the game itself. And so I'm going to end up having to cover a lot more than just scripting. And that's something that it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do to start teaching that. And that's where I landed on Deployable Turrets. So Deployable Turrets is a mod that I know exists in a couple of forums, but I want to do my take on it. I want to build the kinggath version of Deployable Turrets as a concept and mod. And eventually I'm going to release this mod. And so you guys are going to kind of go along for the ride with me as I develop this mod out. So I'm going to do it in phases based around wanting to teach you guys stuff for tutorials. So I'm going to do it in as simple and as broken a way as I know how. Like, I know the way that we're about to do it, it has so many bugs and flaws and so many ways we can improve it as far as making it more full featured. And we'll get to all that. This is something we're not in a hurry to do. It's going to take months, and that's fine. But it gives me a project to focus on where I can show you guys a little bit of something, and then in a follow-up tutorial go deeper into a little piece of that, and we'll just slowly build it up, and I'll be able to teach you guys all different aspects of the creation kit and the game itself and how it works, because scripting ultimately is tied to all of that. So while there will be tutorials along the road that are focused on scripting like this one, they still are going to involve some auxiliary things, because the scripting itself doesn't mean anything if you don't have other stuff to go along with it. Now, there are some exceptions to that. You can do some pretty high-level scripting as far as like writing out frameworks and stuff, and that's the type of thing where if I cover, it's going to be way later and likely not in the same format as I'm going to do this, where it'll be maybe more text tutorials, where I would offer that as extra information for advanced programmers, because that's where that stuff would come into play. I definitely want to focus on things where these tutorials can end in results you guys can see in the game and that I can demonstrate for you. So, because one of the things I mentioned in the intro to this whole series, the whole Bethesda Mod School series, is you got to keep yourself motivated. You got to keep yourself in the game, testing stuff out and seeing that you're making progress. And so I'm going to take that same approach to the tutorials, and doing framework level stuff is pretty hard to demonstrate anything that people can enjoy. So we're going to focus on things that I can that are actionable, things I can show you, and we're going to go from there. So hopefully this is a fun ride. I will try and remember to put deployable turrets in the tutorial title of any of them that involve that. So those of you who just saw that and are excited to build your own version of a deployable turrets can find all those tutorials if you're watching this, years after I made it. So let's get started with this. So there's a couple of things we've got to talk about here. With the actual script, that's actually going to be what we cover last, because I want to first set up the two forms we're going to need. So I came up with a way to do this in a very minimalist approach that involves you having an item in your inventory, which you're going to have to spawn in from the console for now, and we'll eventually cover making like chem station recipes for this or something. But for now, I want to keep it the minimum number of forms I could dream up. So you're going to have an object that you can spawn with console in your inventory, and then when you drop it, it's going to spawn an actual turret, and so we'll need that turret record. And the reason for that is that turrets are actually actors according to the Fallout 4 game or the creation engine. They're actually, the way turrets are set up, they're done the same way as any NPC is. They just can't move. So that was probably smart for them to do. It just made the code simpler, that they could take advantage of all the attacking functionality of actors already, and the various animation systems and the deaths, which all apply nicely to turrets. So they took that and did that, which that means we can't put it in our inventory. We can't carry around an actor in our pocket. So we need that second object in order to facilitate the dropping. So essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to have the player, you're going to spawn in an item in your inventory, and then when you drop it, that item's going to transform secretly, real quickly with a script, into an actual turret. So that's how we're going to make this work. So to do that, we need to set up a couple of things. So we're going to set up an actor. Obviously, we need some sort of NPC to act as our turret, and we need an object that we can drop. So we're going to use the misc item type. So what I've found is a vanilla turret that will work well for our purposes, and we just know how to make a couple of tweaks to it. So I tend to find, and this is one of the things where I'll dive in deeper to this stuff in future tutorials, and this is going to set up the next couple of tutorials. So I'm not going to go over actors in full detail. I'm just going to go over the changes we need to make. But now that I'm introducing you guys to these, this will likely be a tutorial that comes out soon. Same with the misc objects and things like that. So let's open up the ENC Turret Tripod 01 template. The reason I've chosen this one in particular is I wanted the simplest tripod, or the simplest turret. I wanted a low-level one, but I'm choosing one that starts with ENC and ends in template, because those tend to be from Bethesda. If you look up any of the forms under actor, those are the ones that are the most stripped down versions. They're meant to be the ones that all of the leveled list type characters are built on top of. So they don't have a ton of factions applied to them. They don't have a bunch of quest-related things tied to them. So it's less likely I'm going to have to change these much more beyond what they are out of the box. So we're going to open this guy up, and you'll see that I have a second, or a third object window open up here that has some kgdt underscore forms. I already created the mod and off camera, just to make sure that I had all my ducks in a row, because this is a little more complex than the stuff I've been doing so far. And so I'm going to just walk you through my process, but I'm not actually going to create the forms on camera. I'll just tell you what to do when we get to that step. So I'm going to walk you through the whole thing, but know that I'm not going to save the work, because I've already done it. So well, the first thing you want to do anytime you open up a default form like this is change the ID, so that you don't actually overwrite what Bethesda did and then end up having a dirty plugin. So I recommend always starting with some sort of prefix for your mod, so you know what where you can do what I did up here and search for all of your forms at once. And that's really helpful, so you can figure out which stuff you've created. And I went with droppable. I went with, for this one, that was the droppable object. For the actual actor, I went with turret. You can name yours whatever you like, whatever makes sense to you. Actor base, and you'll find out why I'm calling it actor base when we get to the scripting part. There are some things that are not well documented anywhere, and you just have to figure them out by reverse engineering Bethesda stuff, and this is one of those things, which we'll cover in a little bit. But we'll call it tripod and Mark 1. And the reason I'm doing this is in my head, I've already got a lot of ideas of where we can go with this mod. So some of the things I decide on my naming schemes and some of the stuff I do in the script are going to reflect the fact that I have a lot of ideas for where we're going to go with this mod over the next couple of months. And so I'm kind of just preparing for that, so I don't have to redo a bunch of work later. But you guys can name it whatever makes sense to you. And you could do different if you want to work with one of the other ENC turrets. Like maybe you don't want to do tripod. Maybe you want to start right away with a rocket launcher. You could do that as well. but I'm going to go with this one. So we've got it named now, so we don't have to worry about overwriting the vanilla stuff. So now we need to make a couple of changes to this so that it's not going to kill us, because that's what would happen if you were to use this as is. So the primary thing we're going to do is change the faction. And this is one of those things where there could be multiple tutorials on factions, and I will likely start covering them probably soon. I will probably do a factions tutorial because it's super useful now that we're going to introduce our first actor into Bethesda Mod School. So what we want to do is delete the turret faction, and that's because the turret faction by default will fight the player. We don't want that. So instead, we're going to add it right to the player, and you can see what I did. Just for clarification, what I did there, I right-clicked, or actually I selected the faction and hit the delete key on my keyboard. You could also right-click it and choose delete, and then we're right-clicking in this area here and hitting new, and then we're going to filter for player faction. And we're going to double click that to add it. And basically what this means is that anybody who is allied to the player will also be allied to this turret, and anybody who's enemies to the player will also be enemies to this turret. So that's a good way to do this. Since this thing is going to be deployable, we want it basically to be an extension of our character. So then the next thing we need to do is change the way this thing decides to get aggressive on people, and that is handled under the AI data tab. Again, whole tutorial could be done on this, probably will do one, but we're going to just change a couple of small things, and I'll explain right now what they do, and then you can watch for a tutorial on AI attack data sometime down the line. It'll be a real short one because it's just too much for me to get into for this tutorial is going to be long enough as is. But aggro radius behavior, basically turrets will attack anybody that are against their faction if they're within this many units. And to understand units into the game world and a way to make sense of it, your character is 128 units tall, so you can kind of judge based on that. So we're going to uncheck that. So now what that means, by eliminating aggro radius behavior, it means the only way, based on all these settings here, the only way this turret's going to fight anyone is if it's going to assist one of its friends or allies based on this setting. And that's what we want. We want it only to get involved if the player or one of their friends is under assault. Now, we're going to actually change this to helps allies only and not just friends, because there are a lot of random NPCs that are friends that maybe we don't want our turret to jump into combat with. Maybe we want, so this way, by having it only on helps allies, it's basically only going to help us, so we can have control as the player over when this thing is actually engaging in combat. Because one of the ways that I envision this mod going that we're working on, and these are some of the decisions you end up having to make in your own version of the mod. The way I envision it is, if I'm going to be some sort of engineer type character and I'm relying on my turrets, I probably am going to want to be in stealth a lot. I'm probably going to want to pre-set up my combat. I'm not going to want to be like dropping a turret and then having it call down aggro on me right away. So I want to turn off aggro radius behavior so it's not auto attacking, and I don't want it to try and defend like Diamond City guards or something, which are probably flagged as friends to the player. Instead, I only want my direct allies, which are going to be basically your companions, the settlers. So like it's going to be a much smaller group, and that's really the difference between friends and allies. It's just a classification, just levels of allegiance. And again, we'll cover that in the factions tutorial, but basically if we do allies, it's just going to cover, the turret will help less people than if I have it on friends and allies. So this way, with these two changes, putting it in the player faction and changing that AI data, I get control as the player kind of when the combat starts with the turret. So basically now it's only going to start attacking my enemies if they hit me or get real close and are engaged with me, or I as the player start shooting at one of my enemies. So that way I can control when the turret starts engaging. So we're going to hit OK. Well, you guys are going to hit OK and then say yes to that when it comes up, when I ask you to create a new object. I'm going to hit cancel because I already created it. I don't need a second copy. Next, we're going to create our droppable object. So we need something that we can actually have in our inventory. So we're going to go down under items and then misc item. And I have it filtered for BOS because I know they have some mechanical looking doohickeys. And I found an object I like. If you wanna search through them, you can right click on any and hit preview, and then you can just start clicking on different items to see what they look like. And I found I like this capacitor because it kind of looks like a little turret type device. Like I could even, in my head, I could see this animating to where little panels pop out and it becomes the turret that we know and love, the little tripod turret. So maybe one day, we'll find an animator who can do this for us and make this really cool. But this is what I'm going to use as our proxy. That'll work good enough. So what I like to do here is just like we did before, double click the form and then put in our new name, or our new ID rather. And we're going to call this the droppable object. And we want the end part of the name to match so we can match them together. And this will become relevant when we do the script part. Because basically we're going to use the script to tie these two objects together. So obviously we need a different name for this. So we'll call this droppable turret. Actually, we'll call it droppable tripod turret, because maybe we want to do laser turrets later or something. Droppable turret Mark 1. I'm going to go with a weight of, like, say 10 pounds. That'll be one of our balancing features. We can eliminate the player just carrying around infinite of these. Maybe you guys don't want to do that. Maybe you want to keep it weightless, whatever you want to do. This is your mod you're building. You're just following along with me. We're going to get rid of the featured item, because the featured item is what happens when you pick it up, it pops up on your screen to show that you just, and plays that little music like you just found something special. So that's used usually with quest items. We don't want that. And we're also going to delete component data. So component data is what the item can scrap into. And if we leave that in, what would happen is then periodically while the player was building in workshop mode or working at a crafting bench, it could treat this item like junk and actually scrap it, which we don't want to happen. So we're going to get rid of the component data so that it doesn't actually get scrapped. And we're going to leave junk jet ammo, although I could see an argument for leaving that and then making it so after you fire it with the junk jet, then the turret would deploy there. That could be fun. Maybe we'll add that as a feature down the road. But for now, we're going to leave not junk jet ammo. And we'll leave the preview transform and models alone because those looks good. And we'll then hit OK. Well, you guys are going to hit OK and say yes. We'll come back in here in a bit, and this is where we're going to add a script. But we gotta write the script still. So one thing I will do before I close this is talk about the different ways you can add scripts to things and different ways you can create new scripts. So what you'd find in most tutorials and what most people advocate is for you to just click this add button on the thing you want to do a script, and you'll get this nice little window here, and then you can search for things. You can just double click on new script, and that will work just fine. But I'm going to show you a different way, and this is the way I prefer to operate. And there are a couple advantages to it. They're small ones, and they likely won't come into play for most of you. But this is the workflow I enjoy, so it's the one I'm going to show you. You are welcome to do it this way as well. The screens are very, very similar as far as having the filter button and having the option to create a new script. So you can use this as well, but I'm going to do it through something that I don't think everybody knows about, and so I want an opportunity to show it, and because it's just the way I work now, and that's under gameplay. There's something called the Papyrus Script Manager, and this basically is similar to that other screen, but it has a few differences. First, you'll see that there's no new script button. Instead, you have to right-click and hit new to get that. Another thing is that it has these extra columns of information, and this is why I really like it, because it helps me keep track of what's going on. So from here, I can see if a script has been compiled or not, and if I have the source code. So if you don't know what those mean, and for this whole tutorial, I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to cover as much as I can in programming terminology and things like that. I will warn experienced programmers, I am one of those people that's miserable with terminology. I apologize. I wish I was better at it, but I've gotten this far in life without it. And my coworkers and people I work with in the programming community have just gotten used to me using my phrases for things. I'm going to try and use the appropriate terms where I can, but I apologize if I don't. And then for those of you who are new, I'm going to try and go over a few terms here, and hopefully I get them right so that you're learning properly when you talk to other programmers. But a compiled script is basically, or rather, let's start with the source script. So the source script is like the plain text script. That's the if you've seen any examples of programming language stuff of like variables and functions and all the stuff that's typed up by hand by a human, that's what you read, that's what you work out of. And the compiled is the version that the computer uses, and it's usually broken. It's factored down into some sort of assembly language, which is not easy for a human to read, and but much more efficient for a computer to read than what you use. So the compiled scripts, you can see if you compiled your own scripts. You can see in the has source column if, for example, if you extracted some of the mods you have installed, you might have the compiled version but not the source file, and then so you're not going to be able to edit that script, but you'd be able to reference it in your own scripts. And then if you failed to extract the vanilla scripts, you might see that when you start searching those up, they don't have has source yes. If you didn't do that, you're going to want to go into your Fallout 4 data scripts, and then it's either in scripts or source. I've already deleted it, but there'll be a base.zip, I believe it's called, and that has all of the vanilla script files that you can extract. You're going to want to make sure that all of the vanilla scripts are under data scripts source base. They should all be under there. So if we go in, you can see yours should look approximately like this, where you've got the different scripts here. And I don't even know that, I didn't even know they released the Creation Club scripts. That's pretty cool. So we can maybe edit some of the Creation Kit mods. That'll be fun because there's a few of them that I've wanted to see edited. Anyway, so you're going to want to go into your base and make sure you have those so that you can do some vanilla editing of things, because that's a great source of knowledge while you're going through this. One of the best ways to learn to script for this game is to just look at Bethesda scripts for how they did things, and then you can tweak things accordingly. So the last thing that you can do really cool on this menu is you can figure out where scripts are being used. You can see this use info column. If you see a number under there, if you right click on this and choose use info, it will show you all of the different forms or scripts that reference this particular script. It's a great way to trace your way through how Bethesda is using a particular script. So that's why I love this Papyrus script manager. You also, it will show more scripts sometimes than the ad will, just because of the way that some of the flags and the scripts work. That's more complicated stuff. And a cool thing you can do from the Papyrus manager is drag and drop scripts right onto objects, which is really handy. So I can just grab it and drop it into the script name. Actually, I'll just do it. You can just drag it and drop it right on there, which is kind of nice. So I love this Papyrus manager window and highly recommend you guys do. And in most of the tutorials, this is the way I'll be doing it. The one exception will be when we get into fragments later, which most tutorials will start with fragments. I'm going to not start with fragments, mostly because they are too simple. They're something where everything is too absconded from you, so it's hard to learn what exactly is going on. And you can find that in a lot of tutorials, especially tutorials about quest making. So there are times where you have no choice but to use fragments. They just end up being the only place where it makes sense to use those, and we'll cover it when we get to those. I find fragments to be a pain in the butt for remembering to package them correctly, and you'll see why later when we get into that. But for now, we're going to work with a regular script and not a fragment. But this is the window we're going to work out of. Just a quick clarification. I just looked into the Creation Club. I don't think this is actually included. I think these are ones I actually decompiled myself. And decompiling scripts is something I will cover in a future tools video. There is a community tool that's a PEX decompiler that allow you to decompile scripts, which is an awesome way to get access to mod scripts when you're trying to figure out what they did. So we'll cover that in another video, but I just wanted to clarify why I have Creation Club here, because some of you guys are going to go in here, extract all that, and you're not going to have that, and you're going to be confused. So that is why. Okay, so now you'll see in my Papyrus Manager, I have already written a couple of scripts for us, and I'm gonna just bring these up, and we're gonna just work from these, and I'll explain what's going on in them, and show you that way, rather than having to write them all on camera and risk screwing up and having some typos, and then it doesn't work in the game, or you guys see me do something bad. So we're gonna work with scripts I've already tested that I know work. So another thing I really love about this window, you can actually, I believe, you can do it from here as well, but you can actually edit in an external editor, which is what I prefer to do. The actual editor you can't access from this screen, I don't believe. I think even double clicking. Okay, so double clicking. I probably have it set up to bring it up in my external editor, which for me is Notepad++. Love Notepad++. If you want code hinting, there is a set available. I don't have a link to it because I don't use it, which is probably really stupid of me. It probably slows me down a bit. I've always been this way. I don't know why code hinting drives me insane. Having things popping up and trying to autofill for me, it's just a pet peeve of mine. So I tend to not work in a regular IDE, which is, again, I've heard people look at me like I'm crazy. That's just how the way I operate. And so what I end up doing is I have to go to the Creation Kit website a lot and to get definitions for things like events and functions. And if I'm using terminology you don't understand, apologies. I am going to try and walk you through the content of the scripts, but like I said, I can't teach you full 100% programming. I'm just gonna hope that you'll pick it up by proxy through what I'm showing you as far as relevance to Fallout 4, and then you're gonna need to probably do a little research on your own if you're having trouble following all the terminology I'm using. So we'll rely heavily on the creationkit.com site, which is a good resource anyway, because even if you install the code hinting, you are going to find that there's a lot of mystery in the way these are defined. Like you'll find stuff like this in there, but it doesn't fully explain what's going on under the hood. And fortunately, both Bethesda and people in the community have really fleshed out the creationkit.com site, especially with scripting, maybe not with some of the other features, but with scripting in particular. So there's a lot of details about how things work. And some of us, I try to, whenever I find a quirk, I try to go document it on here so that when people run into the same weird behavior I did, they understand why it's doing it and how they can work around it. So creationkit.com is an invaluable resource when you're doing scripting. So now this is the very basic version of the script. So if you saw in the creation kit, there's actually two versions of this script. I originally recorded a version of this video with a more detailed version and decided to re-record with a simplified version of the script that's going to be a little more wonky in game, but it's easier for me to teach this and won't be a 2-hour tutorial. So we're gonna do that. So this version, it has some quirks. When you start using it, you're going to find all sorts of things. You're going to be like, this is broken and this is broken. That's fine. We'll keep improving it with each tutorial we cover this stuff in. My goal, ultimately, like I said, is to release this as an actual mod with my name on it. So I want to get it as perfect as I can. And you guys are just going to kind of go along for the ride with me. And you can make suggestions on how we develop the mod over time. Because at some points, there will be actual gameplay decisions we'll have to just make a decision on about, how is this going to work for the player. So anyway, so this script right here, we're going to edit it in Notepad++. There's also, I believe, a Visual Studio setup that somebody has made for working in Papyrus. Like I said, I'm going to use Notepad++. If you don't have that installed or you don't have some alternate text editor as your default, it's probably, if you go open an external editor, it's going to open it up in just Notepad, which is not ideal, but is still better than the in-game script manager. So I'm going to show you that right now. So this is what a lot of tutorials will show you, is this horrendous window. I hate this thing, and I just refuse to use it. You can use it. It works fine. And it has a built-in object or option to compile right from there. I just hate this window for a variety of reasons that I couldn't even remember anymore because it's been so long since I've used it. So if you don't have Notepad++, don't worry. You can do this all right in the creation kit or in a plain Notepad or something like that. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to break down what this script is actually doing. And to make it less distracting, I'm going to actually hide a lot of this stuff so we can go over this one section at a time. And where's my collapse? You guys feel like I'm foolish for not remembering how to use I can't remember how to collapse. This is I use Notepad+ so much that I don't remember any of its hotkeys. Anyway, so we'll just cut it, and that's fine. Just get it out of here. Get it out of your faces so you can focus on what's important. So at the top of every script, and I guess I should preface and say at the top of every script created in the creation kit by doing new script, we'll start out with this up top here. And you can have comments above this, but the first non-comment line should start with script name and define this. So in order to demonstrate that, let me show you how to create a new script from here. You don't have to do it this way. You can absolutely manually create a file in Notepad and just save it to the appropriate folder, and it'll be fine. But I think most of you will find that creating a new script is going to be easiest to do like this. So you're going to right-click in this Papyrus Manager and hit New. And then you'll name your script here. So in my case, I named it Deployable Turret Demo. I'm actually going to name this Turret Demo 2, so that way I can actually hit yes and create this and then show you that it's the exact same thing as I just have there in my other file. Now, namespace. This is something that for programmers, you guys know exactly why this is important, and if you don't, I'm going to show you why. For Fallout formatting, you need to start doing namespaces. But for non-programmers, namespaces, for as far as you're concerned, are folders. You get to put things into subfolders to keep things organized, and this is super important with modding so that you don't accidentally forget a script or include somebody else's script. Because if you don't use a namespace, when you create this script, it's going to be dumped in the same folder as all of Bethesda's scripts and all of the scripts from other mod authors who don't use namespaces, and it just becomes a mess. And so in your own modding setup on your computer, you're going to have trouble finding your own scripts if you don't use namespaces. So I highly recommend using namespaces. So a namespace is basically you just create the name of a folder you want to see. The creation kit will create this automatically for you if it doesn't already exist. It'll be created under the scripts source folder, and then so in this case mine, I'll get a Deployable Turrets folder created. If you wanted to create multiple levels of namespace, you use a colon to separate them. So like if I wanted to do Deployable Turrets tutorial 1, for example, I could do that, and it would create a second folder under there. So, and in fact, I am going to actually do that, and that way I can try and keep all of my temporary scripts organized like that. So I'll leave that for now. And then extends. This is one that's easy for object-oriented programmers to wrap their heads around. For maybe people who just do a little bit of functional programming, or if not, some of you have never programmed before, this is going to be a tough subject to wrap your head around. So I'm also going to try lightly. Essentially, there are a bunch of low-level scripts that Bethesda has written, and we can find them in the. It's almost they almost are. And there's almost one in there for each of the different object types in here. So there's pretty much a base level, low level script type for each of these types of objects. And so it tends to be that whatever the type of object we are working with, that's what we end up using as the name that we extend. But there are certain types that don't exist in that format, and these are a little more complicated to understand. And the biggest one that you'll find that you use that doesn't exist in that format is an object reference, and that's what we're going to use now. So object reference is basically a copy of any of these forms that you find in the creation kit, but in the game. So if you think about workshop objects, these are a great one to understand from. So when you're building in settlement mode, and say you're placing down wood floor pieces. Well, each wood floor piece that you make is just a copy of one record. So if we bring it up, let's see, workshop, star floor, and we come down to static here. So we've got all these floor pieces, which I'm sure any of you have played any amount of Fallout 4 are familiar with this classic wood piece here. And this guy, each time you build a copy of it, in the game, it creates what's called an object reference. An object reference would be that specific one of this floor in the game world. An object reference is what we want for this particular deployable turret, because each of our turrets that we're dropping on the ground and creating a turret out of is going to be an object reference, and we need to know about that specific one. That's what we're going to operate on. So in this case, object reference is the base type of script we're going to extend from. Now, what really gets confusing here, if we go to the creation kit site and we look up object reference, and if you've never been to creationkit.com, let's go ahead and pop that open so I can show you. When you first get there, you actually choose between Fallout 4 or Skyrim because it has totally different information for them, although there is a lot of overlap, a lot of stuff. If you find something when you're working in the creation kit that you can't find on the Fallout 4 section, go check in the Skyrim section, because some of it didn't get documented in both locations for some reason. But often most things in Skyrim work in Fallout 4, but not vice versa, because there was a lot of new stuff added to the engine. But if you click on Fallout 4, you're going to come to here. And you can search up in the corner here for script stuff, and it will generally come up in search. But the real meaty details are if you click on scripting reference on the left. This is a fantastic resource. It's a little tough to get through if you have trouble with text-based tutorials, but if you're already a programmer, this section on the right here, this Papyrus concepts, if you read through those, by the time you're done, and then after I show you a couple of little demonstrations here to get past some of the things that it took me a little while to click, and maybe for some of you, or maybe I missed a tutorial and that from Bethesda, but this information right here will get most of you who are experienced programmers up to speed with everything you need to know, and it'll even teach you a lot of stuff that's way beyond what you need to know for most functions. And then for those of you who are absolute beginners and you're trying to learn to program, you could probably go through some of their basic tutorials, and it might help you with a little bit with programming. I would still highly recommend, if you want to learn programming in general, go look on YouTube. There's plenty of series, websites like lynda.com. I believe Khan Academy has some. There's plenty of sites that have detailed training guides for learning how to program, and they'll teach you the concepts of variables, functions, and stuff like that. And that's probably what you should walk in with. But like I said, I'll do my best to get you guys a little bit up to speed. You just might have to catch up on some of the things I'm skipping. All right. So extends object reference is what we determined. I apologize if this is a little all over the place. As I have mentioned in a lot of videos, and I'll continue to do so, have a new baby. Lost a lot of my free time, so I'm unable to do a lot of cutting and re-editing and things like that. So apologies for all the screw-ups in these tutorials. But one of the things that might confuse you if you looked at object references, you'll see that it itself extends something. So it's not actually the lowest level script, but what it turns out is that pretty much everything extends from form, which extends from script object. And so when I say the lowest level, I don't mean that literally. I mean basically anything beyond form or beyond script object. Those are the lowest levels you're generally going to be extending from. The extending thing is a real hard thing to wrap your head around, and knowing what to extend from can be a challenge. But what it tends to be, the way I do it, is I look at when I'm trying to do something. with a script, I will tend to just start searching for terms that I think might do what I want. And you can do it either by search there, or if that's not coming up, you can just bring up this screen and then just do a Control F and start searching. So I will just start searching for terms. Like if I was trying to create an object, I might try searching for create and then just look around and see what kind of functions come up. And then once you find a function that sounds like that's going to do what you want, like let's say, okay, we want to get the scale. If you click on it, it will tell you what object or what type of script that function is available to, and that's the type you're going to generally need. It's a little more complex than that, but that's a good place to start. I think the best place to start when you're trying to figure out what to extend and what to do is going to be to go look at things in the game or things in mods that already do what you want to do, and then start with those scripts and work from there and build your way up, and then you'll get past this extend thing. So this is a little complicated, but in this case, because you're just following my tutorial, just put in object reference there. Now, for the sake of fully explaining this screen, if you're not a programmer, you can ignore everything I'm about to say. If you are a programmer, this stuff might be interesting to you. So hidden, basically you do that for framework level type things that you don't ever want to be directly attached to something that maybe are just more native function style. So things that are meant to be, that you're designing that are meant to be extended themselves, you would put that as hidden. And then what happens is hidden scripts won't come up when people use this add button. They'll only be available in the Papyrus manager. So it's just a way to try and discourage people that are working with you on programming stuff to use those directly on objects. The const type means that you can't store any variables that change at runtime on it. There are a couple of other restrictions, but the idea is basically a const script is better for save files because it doesn't need to have an instance created of each object with it. So if you can get away with const, you should. In our case, we actually can, and so but I'm not going to check it in because it might change in the future. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff with this mod in the future, and it's likely that I'm going to need to not have const on there, so I'm just not going to bother for now. But you could, if you can get away with doing const and your script and everything works, then you should. It just makes it more efficient for players to save files. So that is why you would want to do that, but it's not for everybody. In fact, I think most scripts tend to not have const. Conditions are something I don't believe I've covered much of in this series so far, but conditions are a system in the creation kit. For example, if you think about when you're going to set up a constructible item record, I know we've covered that. We've covered the workshop items. If you wanted to lock it out behind something, for example, lock it out a constructible item behind a perk, there's a condition system where you can do things like that, where you can tie into all sorts of different gameplay elements to make sure that at runtime, the game decides whether or not that thing should be allowed. And by checking in conditional on your script, you basically allow the conditions system in the creation kit to access certain variables in your script. So that's what conditional is for. And then documentation string is a little string that will show up on this screen. So if we pop this open here, if there was a documentation string set up, then it would show down here at the bottom a documentation string. I believe that's where it shows up. It might only show up in the if you mouse over the script here, it probably also shows up if you click add. But if I mouse over here, you can see the tooltip that I have in my demo scripts that provides ability to drop turrets. So that's just like it's meant for teams. So if you're not into teams, it's not going to be useful there. But as all of you experienced programmers know, one of the biggest mistakes you can make is assuming that you yourself will remember what you were doing with all of your scripts. And so for those of you who are, somewhat new to programming, maybe resistant to comments, or you haven't convinced yourself to do comments, I'm going to advocate for comments like all of your instructors did, and I'm going to try and give you some different reasons why you might do it, or some different ways to approach it to trick yourself into doing it. Because I know I used to be, when I started programming way back, I was super I would push real hard against comments. I thought they were a waste of time because nobody else is going to look at my code. I thought they would slow me down while I was trying to get an idea out into code form, and I have a solution to that. So we'll go over that in a minute. But documentation string is just for you to give a rough overview of what the actual script is doing. So like I put for this one, allows droppable turrets or something like that. So we'll just do the same thing. And so then once you've got this done, so now if you were a newer coder or somebody who has no coding experience, you can come back and pay attention again if you were drifting off there. So hit OK. That's going to create the script. In this case, it's not showing up here because I have a filter on. But because I believe I named it something similar to that, we can hit refresh here, and there it is. So then if you don't see your script after you do that, filter for it. And if that doesn't come up, hit refresh all and your script will come up. If you created your file manually, like if you just went into a notepad and started a new file and saved it as a .psc, it won't come up here until you hit refresh all. So then we're going to right click on it and we're going to hit open an external editor. And as you can see, it's got the same type of information here. You've got the script name. You can see the different folders I created as the namespaces, and then finally the name of the script, the extends, and then what it extends. Now, if you checked in any of those flags like hidden or const, those would show up here as words at the end. And then you can see our allows droppable turret, our little documentation string showed up here inside of brackets. So that's exactly what this first line is doing. And the reason for this is that accessing files, so like technically the game at runtime could figure this stuff out by looking at the, like it could figure out at least the fact that this is what folder it came from and that this is the name of the script. But by defining it in here, you save the system having to access files at runtime. And then there is for experienced programmers, you can actually cast objects later as your script type if it has that script on it, and then get access to those variables, which can be really, really useful for intermod communication. There's a lot of different tricks you can do with that. We'll get into that many months from now, likely based on the speed I'm doing these tutorials. But there is a good reason for having this as the first line in there. So this is the first line that has to be there. If you used the new button in there and just filled out the forms, it'll come up with this line for you. So you don't have to worry about that. But if you're like me, eventually you get to a point where you don't want to have to use that new button and you just want to do this stuff manually because you just find it quicker to type it all. This is what it is. It's script name, space, and then your namespaces with colons between each folder. And then finally the name of your script without the extension, so without .psc, then a space, then extends space, oops, just dragged that over, and then the script you're actually extending from. All right, so let's go back to our script here. And then we're going to undo the cutting there, and we're going to get back to the next section here. So we're actually going to skip this section here, this actor-based stuff, because I think that it's easier to understand when you look at what we're trying to do. Okay, so let's talk about that commenting thing that I was just mentioning. So I'm going to actually cut all of this out again. So one of the things that I like to do whenever I start programming, and I think most programmers tend to do this, is break down the problem that I'm trying to, or the thing I'm trying to do, into a series of steps. I want to break it down into its minimal components so that way I have a clear path of where I'm trying to go, keeps me focused, and it just helps me organize my thoughts. And what I find, if I do that in text, in comment form here, then I kind of have created myself comments up front and solved the problem that I'm going to have to do anyway of figuring out how I'm going to approach the problem. So then it doesn't feel like I'm slowing down my coding later because the comments are already typed up, and I don't feel like I'm trying to help somebody else. I'm helping myself. So then I just leave that information in there, and that got me past my comment problem. Now I just recognize that usually, 2 years later, when I go back and look at some of my old code, I feel like a moron. So having my comments helps. So like I would do something like this. So first of all, if you want to do comments, comment in code, if you're new, is basically information for yourself or somebody else looking at your script. It won't get included with the script when you compile it so that the game can read it. These things are stripped out, but for you, they're there, and they're basically notes. And to put a note in, you put a semicolon. I like to add a space after. That's not strictly necessary, but a semicolon means anything after this on this line is a comment. So in this case, I'm going to do a semicolon, and then we'll start typing up. For those of you who are programmers who like to do multiple line comments, you start with semicolon and then a /, and then you end with a / and another semicolon, and that is the delimiters to mark the beginning and end of a block of comments. So for most of you, probably just putting a semicolon at the beginning of a line is good. So I'm going to just think about how I want to do this. So we're going to go detect when player drops, and then place turret actor. So that's what we're going to do. So when the player drops this object, we want to place a turret actor. And obviously in more complex scripts, this would be, you'd have a lot more lines of notes for this, but that's how you break it down. Just break it down into the simplest thing you can think of, and then type that up. And then if we just keep that in, as a note later on, at least we'll have we'll understand how our program is flowing, and that's often all you need. And then what you'll find as you mature more as a programmer, you'll find that you start trying to do clever things, and then future you thinks that they're not clever anymore; they're just very stupid. And so those notes are to prove to future you that you are not an idiot. So that's, or your coworkers. So that's where you'll get into more advanced commenting. But even this, I think that's plenty. It explains kind of what I was trying to do, and allows it to go. So I'm gonna cut this property out just to hide it, and we're gonna go over just what this thing is. So I said we want to detect when a player is dropping a turret object. So in order to detect when they're dropping an object, we actually use the event on container change. So events are basically a way for us to respond to things that are happening. So rather than, I'm sure those of your non-experienced programmers, I'm talking to you now. I'm sure you've heard of functions. Maybe you haven't heard of events though, but events are basically functions that get called in response to something happening. That's not the technical correct way to look at it, but that's good enough for our purposes. So if you don't know what a function is, essentially a function is basically when anything named this is typed up in code, then everything inside of this function definition will happen. And events are basically, in Papyrus, for those of you who are advanced programmers, events are basically functions in Papyrus. So they can even be called as functions. You can even actually call this like it was a function, and it would actually run the code. So for our purposes, events are basically functions of a different name. But there's only a certain number of different types of events you can use. So those are predefined. So it is possible to do custom events, but we're not going to cover that yet. So I happen to just know that this is how you detect when something is dropped, though it's not obvious that that's the case. And this is one of those situations where you have to look at mods or things in the game that already do something that you would expect or that you're trying to emulate to try and figure that out. I don't remember how I figured this out. I know I learned it way back when I was doing salvage beacons. I wanted the turrets, I wanted them to be droppable, and I needed to detect that. And I can't remember how I figured it out. I'm sure I reverse engineered it from some other mod though. So that's how you discovered that. But again, if you're not sure, if you haven't seen any other mod do anything similar, this is another point where breaking your project down, what you're trying to do, into individual elements, well, then you can go find at least one element of that. It's like, all right, well, let's think about an instance of where something was dropped. Maybe you couldn't find a deployable turrets mod, but you could find another mod where somebody drops something and something happens, and then you just go look up how that mod does that. So that's how you get to that, and you learn which functions. But outside of that, your other option is to just search for words you know of under the scripting reference section, like I mentioned, to try and think about, they're not always named the way you would expect. And it's just a learning experience of, over time, you'll just start figuring it out. You'll learn all of the different possible events and stuff. All right, so we're defining and to get the definition of an event, we can copy and paste that right from the creation kit site. So I know I want to use on container changed. You could also get these from an example script. So if you were looking into Bethesda source scripts, you would find this and you could copy paste it. But if you look at on any of the definitions of a function or event, you'll find the syntax at the top. You can just copy paste that, and that is the first line of whenever you're dealing with some sort of event or function. So basically we're saying by defining this event in our script here, we're saying that anytime our object that has our script on it, anytime this happens, anytime the container changes, we want this code to happen. That's what we're saying by doing this. So you'll notice that the end event I added there, that's basically how you tell. Just like when we talked about these symbols indicating the beginning and end of a comment, the word event and then end event is how we're telling the engine that this is the start of our event code and this is where it should stop reading it as the event code. And you'll find that pattern is all over the place. So there's like if and then end if, there's function, end function. They kind of follow that pattern everywhere. All right, so then next we have the name of the event, and then here, these are the parameters. So this is the data that's going to be sent by the game engine to our script here. So so this is broken into chunks here. So this is a little bit confusing for new people, but if we look at it, that each of the comma separates different values. So so this right here is our first parameter. And then this one right here is our second parameter. And if we had another comma and more stuff, it'd be our third parameter, etc. And what the parameters, the way they're defined is the first word of a parameter is the script type. And so we're familiar with object reference now. I explained what those are. Then the next word after the space, so there goes the script type, then a space, and then this is just a variable name. Variables, this is something you should come pre-knowing. I don't know how to describe that, how to teach that, but this is the variable name. So this could actually be anything generally, but in this case, we're just going to use the exact ones that Bethesda used to keep it simple. But you could technically change these to anything you want. So if you're an experienced programmer, you don't have to stick with the defaults. I might be mistaken on that with Bethesda's events. It might be that they have to follow the naming scheme. But I know that I've done a lot of name changes on stuff on my custom events. So I'm fairly certain you can mess with these. I think all it looks for is the signature. It's just looking to make sure that the script name matches, and then these don't have to be a perfect match. Could be wrong on that because I do tend to always copy and paste. But I know I've done a lot of custom events where I just make up whatever names I want for this stuff. So that should be, but because we're copy pasting, no problem. We're just going to use these as is. So basically the game is going to send our little event code, the container that the object ended up in, and the container that it came from. And Bethesda was usually pretty good about these names of the variables being very self-explanatory, so you know what it is. Occasionally, though, they're a little cryptic, and then that's, again, where the Creation Kit site comes in handy because they tend to have very explicit explanations of what exactly is happening. In fact, the way I was able to figure out how to determine it was dropping was by reading the stuff on the Creation Kit, so you can see if this is none, the object was dropped. And then so when I read that, I was like, oh, okay, great. So I just need to know if the new container is none. So none is kind of a null, but not really. And that's a programming term that null means that it's nothing. It's nothingness. Now, unfortunately, null does not exist in all forms in Papyrus. So we can't actually, when that ends up creating certain problems later on, I'm sure we'll get to, but in this case, for when you're comparing object references, none is effectively null. So we're saying if this AK new container variable object reference doesn't actually point to anything, that means it's none. There is no object reference. This is blank. Then it'll show up as none. And what the Creation Kit site is saying is that means the object was dropped. So okay, now that's our first step. So we know that if we test to see if AK new container where the object went to is none, we know that that means that this was dropped on the ground. Going in further into programming terminology here, this is an if statement. Now I will clarify that the parentheses here are optional. I just love parentheses. I think they just make my code a lot easier to read. You don't have to have them. You could actually just put a space in there and get rid of this last one, and that's totally valid code. And you will find throughout Bethesda's code they do a mix. Some use it, some use the parentheses, some don't. I like to use the parentheses, so I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to teach people to do it. So the if statement basically says if everything in this line of the if statement, if all of this evaluates to true, so if all of these things happen to be true, and when I say all of these things, be careful with that. If you're a programmer, you already know what I'm about to show you about these operands, but basically when I say everything is true, that can be a little confusing, but basically if you think about this whole thing as one, we'd call it an expression in computer science or in math. But basically, if at the end of the day, if you were to look at all of these things and look at all of the symbols and context, and it turned out that was a true statement, that expression, we would say it evaluated to true, then everything between if and end if will happen. All of this code will get run. So what we're saying here is if the new container is none, that means that it was dropped. That doesn't mean the player dropped it. Now we need to know who dropped it, because technically somebody not the player could drop it. Now you don't see that in the game very often, but because there are other scripts that could cause things to be dropped, it could happen. There are ways that other things could be dropped from not the player. We don't want the turret to be deployed unless it's the player in our case. Now, maybe that's not the case. Maybe for your version of the mod, you're like, yeah, I want to see NPCs using this. I mean, good luck with that. You're going to need to do some pretty heavy AI lifting, which we're not going to cover because I'm not planning on making enemy engineers. Maybe not. Maybe we will one day, but not anytime soon. We want to also make sure that only if the player drops it on the ground. So to do that, we check where did it come from before it was dropped. So we know AK container equals none means it was dropped, so we're good there. Now we need to know where did it come from. So we're going to do AK old container, and we're going to check it if it came from the player. So now there's a little more here to break down. So in Papyrus, equals equals means you're comparing two things together, and if those are the same thing, then that will turn into true. So if you, when we're talking about evaluate to true, in this case, we're saying if AK new container is in fact the same as none, which I said means it's null, it's nothingness, then this would, as far as the game was concerned, this would say that, this would say, oops, spell it right, this would say that. It would be the same thing to the computer. It would evaluate to true. And so that's one block. So equal, for old time programmers, equal is the format that Papyrus uses. And then on the other half over here, we're doing the same type of thing. We're saying is the old container exactly the same as the player. Now, this is something new right here we're going to learn. So game is a special type of script. There's a few of these that basically have a bunch of easy to use functions. Another big one is utility. They have a bunch of functions, and you can search for these on creationkit.com. You can search for game, or you can search for utility. And there's a number of others. And these have a bunch of easy to use functions that do complicated things, do things that normally would require a bunch of background work, but Bethesda needs them so often. They created hard-coded functions that are run at the engine level that are very efficient and great ways to get access to this information. And one of them is game. What you'll see here is when you call a script and then a dot, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I need this thing, either whether it be a function in this case, or I need a variable from this other thing. And that's what we're doing. So we're saying from the game script, we want to call this getPlayer function. And so that's what that dot represents, is we're doing something that's inside of a different script. So and it's a little more complicated than that, and we'll get into it in a little bit because we're actually gonna have to cover it a little more right down here. But so we're saying if AK old container is the same as the player, then this would evaluate to true. So then if this is true, this goes to true. So if we assume that those evaluate down to that, well, then this symbol here, this is an operand that says this is ampersand. By putting two of those in a row, you're saying that this has to be true and this has to be true in order for all of this if statement to be true. So this is one of those programming concepts. It just takes a while to wrap your head around. But then it comes down to just like chaining logic together and following your own logic. But one of the things you'll often see in scripts is instead of the and or the ampersand, which means and, so this and this, you'll find two vertical pipes, which is shift /, and this means or. So then you're saying that if this is true or this is true, then this whole thing is true. And this is one of those programming concepts. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. Hopefully you got it. For old time programmers, I just needed to show you, ampersand or pipe, and that equal. And the other thing we'll get into what the other ones are, but if you're an experienced programmer and you know what the other types you might be looking for are, you're going to find that all in the Papyrus primer stuff that I showed you on creationkit.com. All right. So next, then we have our next note, spawn the turret. So basically the way we're doing this is we're saying as soon as the player drops this particular object, we're going to just spawn the turret right there where the player is. So how do we do that? So first off, there's a couple of things going on here. So we needed a function to spawn some object into the world. So that function is called placeAtMe. And placeAtMe basically is a function that you would find on object reference. And it basically takes whatever you send it as its first parameter or first argument. Whatever you send it there, it's going to create an object reference copy of one of those things. And this is where we need our property up here again. So let's undo our changes. There we go. So there's our property back. So we'll talk about that in a second. But there's a little more going on here that might be confusing before we get into this right here. So we've got object reference and then kTurretRef. So whenever you just randomly in a script, you put down the name of a script and then the name of something, what you're doing is you're defining a variable. In this case, we want an object reference variable. So the reason we know to do an object reference variable here, I'll show you in a minute, but this is defining a variable. This is one of those things you will learn by learning to program in just any language. They all have a similar thing. Sometimes you have to define them in different places. Papyrus, as long as your script is not const, and this is something for advanced users, you can define things globally in your script, and then they're accessible inside of any events or functions. In particular, object references, it's a bad idea to do that just because they end up becoming persisted, and persistence is a very complicated subject, but if you persist thousands and thousands of things, you just overload memory, and eventually the player's game just won't be able to handle it. It'll either lag or crash. And so you want to avoid globally persisting object references unless you absolutely have to. Instead, it's better to just pass them between functions. So now back to everybody, not just advanced users. But we've defined a variable here, and we're saying we want this variable to store whatever this is going to return. So that's what that equals. So the double equal is saying compare these two things and tell me if they're the same. A single equal sign is saying take whatever's on the right and store it on the left. Simple as that. And that's, again, these are basic programming concepts you'll learn. So if this isn't clicking for you, go learn more programming. You'll get more demonstrations. All right, so then in here we know that game.getPlayer, we know that is a reference to the player. And so this is something advanced programmers for Papyrus, it can chain things together, which is really powerful and very awesome that they did that. This is one of the things, every time I learn stuff like this about Papyrus, I'm shocked that they went that far with their scripting language, but awesome. So you can chain together these things. And I'm sure there's a limit at some point. They seem to have arbitrary limits, but they're pretty high usually. So I haven't run into a limit yet of how deep you can chain things. So you can definitely do that. But what we're saying is at the player, we want to place an object. Now, the reason we're doing that, we don't actually need to do this. We could just call placeAtMe, and the reason we could do that is because we're running this on an object reference already. And so if we just search for placeAtMe here, let's back up a little bit, and we'll search for placeAtMe. So you can see the definition of placeAtMe. So placeAtMe comes from object reference. So you can see that in the search, placeAtMe, and it tells you which script it comes from. So we know that any object reference script can call placeAtMe. So technically we could call placeAtMe from this. And what would happen if we just called placeAtMe direct, it would place the turret wherever our object in our inventory that we dropped landed. Now, the problem with that is that objects can end up in really wonky directions, or really what we're trying to solve for is occasionally those objects you drop on the ground can fall through cracks in the world that you can't see. Like it can fall through bad collision, and then you just lost the object, and then your turret would end up in a weird spot. So basically, to avoid that, instead, we're going to place it at the player, who is less likely to have fallen through the world. So we're just going to use game.getPlayer to call placeAtMe instead of calling it right on our object we dropped, which is what would happen if you got rid of the game.getPlayer. So we're going to place our object right at where the player is with placeAtMe. And we're storing whatever object is placed inside of kTurretRef. We don't actually have to do that. That's just good programming practice. If a function returns something, and I'll show you how you figure that out in a minute, but if a function returns some sort of data and you don't catch it, if you don't have some sort of variable to catch it, you end up with these temp variable warnings in your Papyrus log, which isn't the end of the world, but it's just good practice to get into, just catching those. And then if you need them later, you have access to them. So if you needed to do something to this turret object reference, you could. But it's just good programming practice. If you ever see that a function is going to return something, just make sure that you're storing it for later use. I'm sure somebody out there could argue against that to me, and that's fine. But this is what I like to do, and I'm just going to try and teach people good habits up front. All right, so now let's look at the definition of placeAtMe. So it's much longer than that than the on container changed event definition was. And I'm going to copy paste this so I can break down what's going on here, because there's a lot here. And you actually don't need the native flag at the end there. So if you ever see that, you can skip that part when you're copy pasting. So we're going to copy paste this guy. And I'm going to just paste it down here just so I can go over what's going on with it. So first up is whenever you see the word function, that's an indication you're looking at the definition of a function. Some of them will have a word before and some won't. If they have a word before, it's telling you when this function is run, it's going to kick back something of this script type. So if this isn't here, that means that this function is not going to kick back anything. And so then you don't need to set something equal to it. There's nothing for it to kick back to you. In this case, our function starts with object reference. So that means it's going to kick back an object reference. And that means that our variable that we're storing in needs to be an object reference. There are exceptions to that. Well, when we get into deeper extended scripts and casting, that's too advanced for this. So we're just going to say for now, for the sake of the simplification of this tutorial, which is already more complex and long than I'd like, you just, whatever you see left of function, make sure that the variable you're using to catch it with is the same type. Simple as that. All right, so then we've got the word function. Then we got the name of our function. This is what people would use in other scripts to run this code that's inside of that this does. Then we've got our arguments or our parameters, and you'll see that that follows the same pattern as the events. So it's the script type that it's accepting or expecting, and then a variable name. And so unlike events are, this data is going to be sent from the game world. In the case of functions, you are filling this out yourself, and you're sending the game that information. So there's a bunch of different things here. Now, I'm not going to go over specifically what all these do yet. We'll cover this in more advanced tutorials later, but I want to cover one thing in particular about this, and that's that you'll notice that this one has, so if we talked about here that the commas indicate each one of these being a new parameter or a new argument, you'll notice that I only put one argument here, but this thing has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different arguments. So why was I able to skip all those extra ones? Why didn't I have to fill them all? And that's because after this first one, each of these has a default set, and that default is defined if in the parameter there's an equal sign and then some sort of information. And when that occurs, those are all, you can leave those out. Now, I said skippable at first. That's not exactly true. You can't, to skip around, like I can't just skip these first two and then start off with these two. I mean, you can technically, but that's, again, more advanced, and we'll cover that again in another tutorial. But in general, these need to come in this exact order. It's kind of an all or nothing situation when you start doing these. You need to do all of the ones up to the last one you want. And then any of them that you leave out that have this equal, what it'll do is it'll basically just say that just use this value because I didn't have an opinion on it. So just use whatever you normally use. That's what this equal is basically saying. So when there's a bunch of defaults like this, you can just leave them. And that's what we're going to do for this case. Again, I'll go into describing what these things do, but because we're not using them for this particular tutorial, we're going to just skip over what those do. I just wanted to cover the fact that this means those are optional effectively by having the equal or not pseudo optional. So we can skip all of those and just do this first one. All right, so now this first one, and let me undo that just so we have this. I'm going to get this. I'm going to just delete these to hide them. So this first one is a type form. And a form is a very interesting type in that almost everything in the creation kit, we've talked about this before in other tutorials, that all of these are technically forms. So what this is saying is that PlaySetMe can place pretty much anything. There are a few exceptions that it can't place, but almost anything you can create in the creation kit can be placed into the game world dynamically with this PlaySetMe function, which is really powerful. But now this is one of the things that hung me up when I was first learning Papyrus. And so hopefully I will save some of you a headache. What I was doing and was doing incorrectly was I kept typing the names of things in here. I was just typing in these editor IDs into PlaySetMe. Why won't this work? Why won't it compile? Why doesn't it work? What it turns out is what you have to do is define a property, and then you point in the properties window, which you've probably seen in some of my other tutorials, but in the property window, you point your variable to one of these forms here. And now whenever that variable is used, it knows because of this property screen to look for that form. And that's how you connect things. It's that simple. I had no idea. It took me forever to learn that. Once I got that and it clicked, it just made everything so much easier to program with Papyrus. Now let's go over a property definition. So a property is just a fancy variable. It has a couple of interesting properties about the property. But one is that it can be accessed through other scripts with the dot method. So if you were to look at the object reference, so if we go to the object reference definition, which object reference is a script type, and if you go on the creation kit and you look at any type, some of them just below the definition, which we've been, and the syntax, which we've been copying, you'll see that there's a properties section. And this is things that can be accessed from outside. So in any object reference, it actually has its X, Y, and Z coordinates stored so that they can easily be accessed in a script. And so basically a property allows that thing to be accessed. So in other words, we could do, for example, we could do kturretref.x, and now we've got its X coordinate in the world. And we could use that for things. So that is just a number that we could use. So by defining a property, it's something that can be accessed externally. So that's one feature of it. Another feature of it is that you can define it in the creation kit now, which is what we need. So anytime you want to access forms in the creation kit, this is generally what you'd want to do. There are other ways to do it, but they're much more complicated, and eventually I will show them, but not anytime soon. But for the most part, you're going to be, if you want to define some sort of form for scripts to use, you're going to want to define it as a property. And then there are these flags afterward, and these are a little more complicated. These 3 flags are the ones you're going to use 90% of the time. So auto, for non-programmers, just always use this. For programmers, if you skip auto, it allows you to define getters and setters manually, and you can learn how to do that in the creationkit.com site. Const means that the const is very useful to use because what it basically says is whatever I set up in the creation kit, that's what the game should use. And that way, if later when you're working on your mod, you decide to patch it and change what this property is pointing at, it will update in the player's game. But if you don't set const, then the player's game will always just know whatever was there at the time they installed the mod and the object was created. So then so if you changed this deployable turret actor, then any turrets they had in their inventory already would still point to the old one before you update it. So const is a very good idea whenever it makes sense to use for you. There will be occasions where we don't use it, and hopefully I'll get to an example at some point, but most of your uses are going to include const. And then mandatory is something you don't usually need, but I really like and I've fallen in love with using. And what that does is anything your script is absolutely going to need to function. And there's reasons where you might not need a particular property, but we're not going to get into that today. But it makes it red in here, and it will remind you if you hit OK, it reminds you that you didn't fill those out. And it's just a great way to avoid silly mistakes of leaving some left or unfilled. And also when you start getting more complicated scripts, you can end up with a pretty sizable amount of properties, and then the red ones really stand out from the list, so you know which ones you need to refill. So if you're editing your script later, which we definitely will be, and adding more properties, having the mandatory flag, make sure that they stand out, that they're not filled in yet. So this is basically just a fancy variable that we can define in the creation kit by adding that property keyword between the variable script type and the name of our variable. And then these extra flags are just useful for various things. So auto, you non-programmers are always going to want to use. Programmers, maybe you set up your own getters and setters instead. All right, so then what we did here was we said place at me, and we're telling it we want it to place this deployable turret actor variable. So now here is something that's confusing only because it's not it's not clear in the creation kit. So I mentioned that for the most part, any of the script types are going to pair up to the type of object here. So for example, there is a script type called static. There's one called furniture, there's one called flora, etc. One that you see in the creation kit named one thing that does not match up correctly with the in-game, and that's actor. So these all show actor, but these are actually actor bases, and this is why I named my turret actor base. These are actually, the forms are actually actor base, and actor is actually the object reference version of an NPC. And that's very confusing, but just know that anytime you're trying to point a property to one of these actor records, it's called actor base in the script type. It's confusing, unfortunate, because actor is used for something else, but that's what it is, actor base. So we're basically, and by defining, so this is another point where you might be confused right now. Some of you very confused, others a little less confused. But the place at me asked for a form. It didn't ask for an actor base. Well, the thing is that actor base extends form. So if we were to go look up actor base, and this is just something you learn about the form type. Form is the most generic, almost the most generic type script. The actual most generic is called script object, but everything extends from, almost everything extends from form. So if a function calls for something, so if it calls for a specific type, you can send it instead anything that extends it. So anything that extended an object reference, you would actually be able to send it one of our objects because ours extends object reference. So that's good enough for the game. As long as it's something that extends that original thing, that works. So in this case, if we look at the actor base script, you can see it extends form. So extends form script. So since place at me was looking for a form, an actor base extends form, it will accept an actor base. Now, the reason we do that, technically we could have just put up form here as the type of property and then had it match place at me perfectly. The reason we don't do that is for the to make it easier on ourselves in the creation kit. So we're going to go ahead. So I've already compiled this script. If you had just wrote the script and you just saved it and you were just following along, you would come in here and you would right click on your script and hit compile, and then it'll give you any errors if you screwed up, so that you can fix them, and it tells you the line number, and it's real easy to figure out what's going wrong. So that's how you would, once you've got it compiled and you've dragged and dropped it onto here. so that you can see it. Then if you double click it, you'll bring up this property screen. So now if I double click my property name, if I had just left it as form, what would happen is I would get a second drop down where I would have to choose actor base and then choose my object. So it just makes it a little more work to actually find the object, where in this case, I only have the one, so I can just filter for it. So we'll just filter for KGDT, and we'll find our tripod here, and we'll hit OK. And then there we go. We hit OK, and now our script variable knows about our actor base that we want to be created. And like I said, you guys could create your own if you wanted to do like a missile turret or something else instead. I went with the tripod. But that's it. You're ready to go. Ready to go test this in the game now. Hopefully I did a thorough explanation of this, and so even non-programmers were able to follow along. There is so much more to cover in Papyrus. Do not expect to learn this overnight. And if you have no programming experience, you're probably going to want to go. I've hopefully now convinced you to go do some basic like early introductory lessons in programming. So we're going to save this. We're going to pop in the game, and I'm going to show you guys that it works. All right, I found another quick thing before we get in the game. If you ever go to compile your script and you get failure to create project file, a little pop-up on there in the compile window, that usually just means you need to reboot the CK. All right, let's get in the game. Console command typed up here. If you don't know how to figure out the ID of your thing, that is, there are a lot of ways to learn that, but basically this is your load order number, your first 2 digits, and these last 6 are the ones in the creation kit for that miscellaneous object. So we're going to add 5 of those to our inventory. So there we go, deployable turret tripod Mark 1. And then if we pop in to our, should be under miscellaneous tab, but depending on the mods you have installed, or if you forgot to remove the components, it might show up under junk. There it is, deployable turret. So we'll go ahead and drop this guy. And there's our turret. And one thing that might happen for some of you is you might find that you can actually pick up the object again and then just keep reusing it. I actually have a more complicated version of the script that I did off camera when I was planning this out, and then I ended up redoing the tutorial to do a simpler version of the script because I realized I was going to overwhelm folks more than I probably just did. And so for you probably have that object still on the ground. You can pick it up and just keep redropping it and spawning more turrets. That's the type of thing we'll fix. There's a lot more we can do with this. I have so many cool ideas for this mod, and I'm sure you guys are going to have some suggestions. We'll definitely cover those. But likely what's going to happen is that I'm not going to just focus on Papyrus. I'm now going to use this opportunity to talk about, do tutorial on factions and use this as a way to segue, because I think for a lot of folks, they're just following along with the tutorials to just learn all the different things. Because one of the more difficult parts about modding Fallout 4 is there's so many interconnected systems, and that you end up having to use so many different form types that it's very hard to make effective mods without understanding a little bit of everything. So it's really it's the tool for the jack of all trades in a big way. So it ends up being that you're going to end up needing to learn a lot about or a little about a lot of different subjects. And so I'm going to be doing that, and then we'll periodically come back and try and do scripting. I'm highly interested in feedback on this particular episode, because scripting is such an important part of modding, and I recognize that the format I used is probably difficult for new programmers, but too slow for advanced programmers. So I'm looking for feedback. Did I do enough to help you guys who are new? And for those of you guys who are old hands, did I explain enough of the things that make Papyrus distinct? Did I cover the things that maybe were helping you with the syntax and explain to you what's going on under the hood? Like, did I give you enough? Did I not give you enough? Just give me any type of feedback, no matter what your level. Let me know what your level of experience is and what you thought about this particular format. So that way, when I do the next tutorial that has a big Papyrus focus, I can direct things in the appropriate way. So if you liked the format, definitely comment on that as well, because if I just have a couple people complaining about it and nobody saying yes, this is perfect, I'm apt to steer toward the direction that they push me in. So definitely lots of feedback on these scripting tutorials so that I can get them right going forward. All right, guys, I look forward to developing deployable turrets with y'all. And if any of you wants to get ahead of me and run with this idea and release your own version, go for it. I think there's already a couple other deployable turret mods. But I'm going to release a version eventually based on everything we do in this tutorial.